Hello, this is going to be our makeup lecture for week 6, lecture 1. Now, it's been a while since we spoke about China, so I want to go over a bit of review. First of all, uh, we'll talk about the Qing dynasty, of course, has been, even though it started off as a very powerful, strong dynasty, in the late 18th century start to see signs of decline, and these increase throughout the 19th century. And there's various reasons for this decline. One is population growth outstrips food supply, leading to famine. There's a breakdown in government, an increase in government corruption, and so the government isn't able to deal with problems like famine. Of course, you have the the Qing dynasty government is defeated in the two Opium Wars. It's not able to keep out the foreigners, right? And this, of course, makes the dynasty look bad. It hurts its claims to the mandate of heaven. And you also, as we talked about, you have in Chinese religion this always this kind of just under the surface, this notion of the coming apocalypse. And when things get bad, this bubbles right back up. So you have we talked about we talked about the White Lotus rebellions. We talked about one particular rebellion, the 13 trigrams. We talked about the Taiping, which is kind of a mix of Chinese religion plus Christianity. Several weeks ago, we noted that there was an Islamic rebellion that begins in 1864, and of course the Boxer Rebellion. And these rebellions, and even though the Boxer Rebellion ends up being pro-Qing in the end, it's still the Qing are defeated right by the Eight-Nation Alliance, and it looks really bad for them and the mandate of heaven. So these rebellions are both a sign of decline, and they also encourage decline because of the money, time, and effort it takes to put them down, and because it shows for all the world to see, and especially for all Chinese to see, that the Qing are having troubles. Now, Christianity fits in this in a very complex way. On one side, of course, Christianity helps inspire the Taiping Rebellion, and Christianity is often a socially disruptive force, right? Because you have, when people become Christians, they stop participating in various rituals, village rituals or Confucian rituals, which are understood to be the kind of glue that holds Chinese society together. And also foreign missionaries are able to compete with elites over the hearts and minds of Chinese people, and are so able to threaten their power bases. And also Christianity puts the Qing dynasty in a very difficult position, right? The Qing has been forced to allow missionaries to come into their country and to even into the interior and to spread Christianity. And of course this makes it harder for them to claim ritual hegemony and moral hegemony as well, right? And this is part of they use these ideas to help encourage their own right to rule. And so the elites look at them and say, at the Qing dynasty, and say, wow, the Qing dynasty is weak, it's not able to do this. It's not able to protect us from these Christians. We need to take matters in our own hands, which leads to local persecution, such as the 1870 Tientsin incident, which quite a few Westerners are killed. And this hurts then the Qing dynasty, then forced to punish its own people rather than the missionaries, and is forced to pay lots of money to the foreign government. So the Qing dynasty isn't able to please anyone. The local people are upset with the Qing, and the Westerners are also upset with the Qing for failing to protect the missionaries. And this, of course, just leads to a constant cycle where the Qing dynasty becomes weaker and weaker and weaker. At the same time, though, we don't want to just paint a negative picture of Christianity or of Christians or the missionaries. We have to remember the Christians were bringing a promise of new knowledge, and many people thought this could save the country. In particular, Protestant Christians were bringing this vision of a liberal, democratic, Christianized, civilized China. For many of these Protestant Christians, they did things like oppose opium use. They opposed the foot binding. They argued that women should be educated, that women should have a greater place in society. Certainly not as far, they wouldn't go as far as a modern feminist would go, but they were offering something to women and to other marginalized groups that they hadn't had before. So it's a complex, and of course when you offer this kind of thing, it threatens the people that are already there. So even in Christianity, offering this kind of new knowledge that we would see as bringing good benefits, it still threatens the old society. And of course we also have to remember that many people also really believed in the Christian message, that they really thought that if they believed this religion, they could save their souls and go to heaven, right? So this it's kind of a complex picture, and that's something we need to keep in mind. Now, our objectives today is to see the rise of demand for radical reform to save the Chinese nation and the continuation of old ideas implicitly and explicitly even under these kind of radical ideas, and to see how religion kind of fits in all of this. Now, we need to define a term before we continue, and that term is nationalism. And the idea of nationalism, first of all, is that each nation should have its own state. Each people, so Japanese people should have a Japanese state, Korean should have a Japanese state, Chinese people should have a Chinese state. The trick, of course, is what counts as a Chinese person, right? And one other way you can kind of think of nationalism is just we should not be ruled by foreigners. That's one of my favorite definitions. Of course, that also brings in the issue of who is a foreigner. But there's kind of a transformation that goes on when you have the establishment of a modern nation state. We talk about people who are members of the old empires as being subjects. You'd be a subject to the Habsburg Empire, a subject to the Ottoman Empire, a subject to the Qing Empire. But you shift over in this case to, and this shift though to citizens means that instead of just being a group of people who just pay taxes and try and avoid getting in trouble with the government, you're supposed to actively support the government, right? Because it's your government, it's your nation state. This is a nation, this is a state that exists to protect the nation. Who is the nation? It's you, right? So you have this shift then, and the idea of this is that by binding people close to the state, by expecting them to do more than just pay their taxes and be good, you can unleash their energy to serve the state and make it more powerful, right? You can see this in the, for example, the old empires would employ mercenaries, but new nation states, for example, France, in the late 18th century after the French Revolution, is able to raise these massive conscript armies, because there's this idea that as a citizen you have the duty to fight for the state. And even though this was unpopular for many people, other people greatly supported this and were quite willing to go off and serve this, because they had this idea that the state existed for them, and they should take an active part because their interests were the same as those of the state. So the idea is that you can think subjects to citizens, it makes you more active, it makes you more powerful within the state, you get certain privileges and rights, and it unleashes the energy of the people then to serve the state. Now, the key thing though with nationalism is that it really stresses that the nation state is your primary loyalty. It's above religion, it's above the family, it's above everything else. Your first loyalty should be to the nation state. And this will make things, of course, very tricky if you were a religious person, because usually religions claim universal authority, not simply authority to a certain geographical area, like that claimed by a nation state. Now, this is very bad for multi-ethnic empires. For example, the Qing, because you have Manchus ruling Han Chinese, and the Han Chinese are able to say, we shouldn't be ruled by foreigners, right? Our Han Chinese nation should have its own state. Now, what ends up happening though is that the Han Chinese will use that as a way to justify rebelling against the Qing. But then later on, they'll also claim control over Manchuria and say it's just fine for us foreign Han Chinese to rule Manchuria, because we're not actually really foreigners. Actually, we're all members of the Chinese Republic, and it creates kind of a conundrum, as you can see. But if you have the strength to do it, you can pull it off. But the key thing here is that you can use the logic of nationalism to say we shouldn't be ruled by foreigners. We Han Chinese should not be ruled by these barbarian Manchus. Therefore, we can rebel and overthrow them. And the key thing also about nationalism that's tricky is it allows imperialism, this ability to move people from being subjects to being citizens, to get them to be bound more closely to the state, unleashes a power that they can be projected into taking over other countries. This is why Japan is able to take over Korea, essentially, because it's able to draw upon the power of its citizens gained through nationalism to project its power into Korea. And it's the same thing for much of the Western empires as well. At the same time, though, imperialism can lead to increased nationalism, and that's also what's going on in China, right? Western imperialism in the form of the Opium Wars, in forms of unequal treaties and so forth, convinced Chinese people that they have the same interests, right? Instead of just Chinese people struggling with Chinese people start saying, hey, look, we're all being treated equally badly by these foreigners. We need to stick together, right? And so this then encourages nationalism, which then encourages them to resist imperialism. But of course, one could argue that once China obtains its nationalist goals of kicking out the imperialists, it then goes out and becomes an empire itself by incorporating Tibet, Manchuria, Xinjiang, and all these other areas that you'll remember were part of the Qing Empire, but were not considered a part of China proper, though they are now, because the People's Republic has had the power to be able to expand into them. Now, the Qing Empire did attempt to reform itself. You'll remember we talked about this idea of self-strengthening, which in the end doesn't work, right? And we saw that because Japan defeats China in the Sino-Japanese War. Japan is had undertaken radical reform, had made major changes to its government. China didn't, and just made this kind of self-strengthening, oh, we just need guns and factories and then we'll be fine. We don't need to change the ruling system or anything else like that. And the war showed that China did in fact need to make those changes, right? Japan had made those changes and it was victorious. China had failed to make those changes and it lost, right? And of course, Chinese, especially the Manchu elite and of course the Han Chinese elite, were hesitant to make any major changes because making major changes would draw them away from their old religious doctrines of legitimacy, such as the mandate of heaven, and so forth. And they would also, of course, cut at their own power because Confucian knowledge wouldn't be the key to government service. Now, after the Sino-Japanese War, but before the Boxer Uprising, you do have a period of attempted radical reform, and these are the so-called 100 days of reforms. You can see it doesn't last that long. And it focuses on a man named Kang Youwei, which is described, Dubois spends a lot of time talking about him. And Kang is kind of your typical Confucian scholar getting ready to take the exams and is very anti-foreign until he goes to Shanghai. And Shanghai is a city in China, major city in China, that is dominated by foreigners at this time. And he's amazed because when he goes into the foreign parts of Shanghai, the French Quarter, the British Quarter, and so forth, things are being run better than in the rest of China. The streets are cleaner, it's safer, it's nicer, there's new products that you can get that are more difficult to get elsewhere. It's really amazing to him, and he realizes that there's something to the West. There's something that they have to offer China. And what he does is being a scholar, he begins to write, and he begins to rethink these things. And he writes a book called Confucius the Reformer. I don't want to get too far into this, but basically what he does is he goes through the Confucian ideas and he extracts the ones that present Confucius as a radical reformer. Rather than someone who is looking to maintain tradition, he presents Confucius as a reformer. And if Confucius is a reformer, then we can reform, including Confucianism, right? He's attempting to offer radical reform clothed in Confucian rhetoric, because that's essentially what he needs to do if he wants to reform China at this time and please the people above him. And he eventually becomes an advisor to the emperor. And what he attempts to do is he attempts many reforms. In a sense, he moves too far too fast, and this leads to his downfall. And to give you kind of an example, one thing he wants to do is to change the kind of knowledge that people are learning in China and what kind of knowledge gives you power within China. Confucian knowledge, the knowledge you needed to pass the exams to become a government official, was moral knowledge, right? It was knowledge of the Confucian classics and how to be a good moral person. He argued that that Chinese people should get away from that and change to technical knowledge, engineering, science, that sort of thing. And of course, if you spent the last 10, 20 years of your life studying for the Confucian exams, or have passed the Confucian exams, and your power within the government is based on the degree you earn from that, you're not going to be for getting rid of Confucian knowledge as the source of power, right? You're going to oppose that. And that's, of course, why China engaged in self-strengthening and not radical reform. And eventually, this kind of conservative reform crushes Kang and his movement. he escapes to Japan, but some of his advisors are killed. The ruler is moved out of the way by the Dowager Empress, and he will die at an early age. It's believed she arranged for him to be poisoned. So this kind of radical reform is stopped. But what's important to stress about Kong and about some of the other people we're going to be talking about, and who are talked about in Dubois, Lu Xun, and Chiang Kai-shek, there are some certain foundational ideas of Chinese thought that are there even when you're proposing radical reform. One of these is that national salvation will depend on morality, right? China is a very pragmatic culture and country, and that emphasizes the importance of morality. And there's this idea that in order for us to become a strong, powerful nation, we need to become a moral nation. And this is actually one reason why Christianity was affirmed by some Chinese nationalists, and as we'll see also by Korean nationalists, because the idea of Christian nationalism was that by admitting your sin, God would give you moral power, spiritual power that would help you to overcome it and become a better person, right? And this is one reason why, for example, Catholics in Koreans were attracted to Catholicism, because it offered them God's grace, and with God's grace, it's kind of a spiritual energy that will help you be a good person, right? So this is one reason why some were interested in Christianity. But even if they weren't interested in Christianity, this is pretty much a thought idea that all kind of had. There was also an idea that the masses should be taught by the elites, right? Remember this idea that kind of we have in Confucianism that virtue flows downhill. Now, we also have to stress, even though it's a foundational idea in Chinese thought, there were people who didn't quite trust the elites. They accepted this idea that virtue went downhill, but they said it went downhill from the leader, kind of bypassing the elites, getting to the people. You can see this with the Hongwu Emperor, right? He never quite trusts his elites. And we'll see this with Mao Zedong. He doesn't either, and will attempt to go right to the people. And there's a tendency by these elites, except for the Hongwu Emperor and Mao Zedong and other populists like them, to see the masses as just really a problem. Now, Mao would agree that they were mired in superstition, and the Hongwu Emperor might have. But even so, Mao thought that they were the solution. But in any case, pretty much all agreed that the masses were mired in superstition, and that had to change. And key to this was education. And you can see this in some of Kong's proposals, and some of these were acted out, and Dubois talks about them, this idea of converting temples to schools, to use the property and buildings of the temples to support and establish schools that would teach modern secular knowledge, right? So Confucians, who emphasized morality and education, were being criticized. Traditional Confucians who promoted morality and education were being criticized by radical reformers who promoted morality and education. But they had quite a different kind of component, content to those ideas. Now, the Qing dynasty finds themselves in a very difficult position. As we point out earlier, limited reform just does not give them the strength, right? They're defeated by the Japanese. And a strange thing happens, right? Kang Youwei is in charge during, has this attempt at reform before the Boxer Rebellion. That is crushed. The Boxer Rebellion rises up. The Qing throw their weight behind it, declare war on all the 8-nation alliance, and of course they're defeated. And after that, they finally accept radical reform, right? So they accept Kang Youwei's position after they've driven him out of power and killed him, some of his allies. But the problem is, for the Qing dynasty, is that these self-strengthening proponents and the other people who opposed reform turned out to be right. Radical reform would destroy the old ideas, the old religious ideas that the government ruled through and drew its legitimacy from, right? The government, the only reason that the Manchus were accepted as the leader of China was this idea of the mandate of heaven, right? That they had obtained the mandate of heaven, and that according to this kind of Confucian model, you could be ruled by barbarians so long as they had the heaven's mandate, right? So as long as the Qing stuck with Confucianism and the mandate of heaven, they had some legitimacy, right? Among the old conservative elite, among people who base their ideas on a Confucian worldview and so forth. But once they got rid of that, and they do this by getting rid of the examinations, they get rid of the Chinese examinations. I think in 1906 they get rid of the exams. Get rid of the Confucian exams. What do they have now? They don't have an orthodoxy anymore. And what fills that void, of course, is nationalism. And the logic of nationalism is we shouldn't be ruled by foreigners. So the Qing by accepting radical reform, destroy their own religious claims to legitimacy. And so what's amazing then is they send all these, for example, the Qing will send students to Japan on government scholarships. These people will become opposed to the Qing dynasty because they're exposed to radical ideas, to nationalism and so forth in Japan. They see how great things are in Japan and they want to do that to China. So these people on government scholarships turn against the government that paid for their schooling. You can see this in particular in the life of Qiu Jin. She was sent to Japan. She's famous as one of China's first feminists. You'll see she didn't live very long though, and the reason she didn't live very long was because after she became radicalized in Japan, she returned to China and wrote, and then became involved in a plot to kill a Manchu governor, which succeeded, and she was executed. And this is key: you can draw a line from her going to Japan and getting radicalized there to then helping take part in a conspiracy to successfully assassinate this Manchu official. So we can see how these kind of radical ideas are destroying the Qing dynasty and its ability to rule. So you have this growing radicals who accept nationalism, not the mandate of heaven, and not Confucianism, as the answer to China's ills and as what legitimizes a government, right? So they're turning, in a sense, from a religious worldview of the mandate of heaven of Confucianism, which can allow for even barbarians to rule China because they're virtuous, to an idea of nationalism. We can't be ruled by foreigners. The Chinese nation should be ruled by a Chinese state. And there's a group of people in a city named Wuchang who believe in this. They're revolutionaries, and they're trying to stage a revolution, and they're making bombs, and they're smoking while they're making bombs, which is a really bad idea. And some cigarette ashes fall into the bombs and explode, and of course the police come looking to see what was going on, and they find the notebooks. They find when they're investigating this, that these people had a list of all the revolutionaries. They wrote down all the names of everyone that was going to be involved in the revolution. This wasn't necessarily the best things to do. So the revolutionaries realized that they were all going to be arrested, so they might as well just go ahead and revolt anyway. And they do. And the Qing government has so little... and as they revolt, other cities also rise up and revolt, right? We see the snowballing effect. The same effect you see with these religions, right? A small group of people can rebel, and that rebellion can become very large. That's what happens here in Wuchang. And the Qing government is so weak that it just collapses, essentially. And the emperor abdicates in 1912, and you have an ascent of eventually you have Sun Yat-sen as president for a short time, but eventually Yuan Shikai becomes president because he has an army and Sun Yat-sen doesn't. And China then becomes in a very difficult position because the old orthodoxy is gone, right? The old mandate of heaven is gone. There's no clear new orthodoxy. There's an idea that China should get rid of should have a revolution, but it's not clear what China should be like after the revolution, other than it should be a republic. And one thing we should stress, I mean, a republic. I certainly will not criticize republics. We live in a republic. I rather like living in a republic, but Republicanism is essentially a means. Democracy is a means. It's about voting to a large degree, and it doesn't have a kind of much content in many ways beyond that, right? I mean, our democracy has a kind of content because of the Bill of Rights and so forth, but they weren't sure quite what this Republican government should be doing, right? And what it would mean, other than it would mean that China would have its own government, would not be ruled by foreigners anymore. And the other problem was Yuan Shikai was certainly not a Republican. He didn't believe in republics. He was an old Qing official who had an army. That's why he was powerful. So you had a Republican government with a non-Republican at its head with no clear new orthodoxy. And so basically China fell into chaos, fell into multiple warring states, essentially all these warlords fighting with each other. And Yuan, in a kind of a desperate attempt to keep things together, crowned himself emperor, and people just laughed at him, essentially. And China then just descended into almost complete chaos, into a country that was divided into many different warring states. So they succeeded in the revolution in terms of overthrowing the Qing. They failed, though, in establishing a government that could take its place effectively. So in China, then you have a growing sense of nationalism. Now there's some real regional, despite these problems, and in fact, in part of it is because of these problems. Now there's a regional variance in terms of the growth of nationalism. It's concentrated typically in the cities and stronger there than in the countryside. And this is in part because it's the cities that have contact with foreigners. It's the cities where Chinese people experience prejudice from foreigners, experience disadvantages from foreigners, which is particularly galling because, of course, they're in their own country. They're in China. And in many of these places, they kind of end up being second-class citizens, right? And so among these Chinese people, despite the fact that the Chinese central government, which is theoretic, despite the fact that China is really divided, there's a growing sense of nationalism. There's a growing sense of togetherness that will eventually help bring the country back together. And this is in a sense forged because of Western and Japanese imperialism in China. Now, China, even though you have kind of a centralized, it's very complex, but you have kind of a centralized government, even though in reality you have several different, what are essentially different states. There is one centralized government that claims to represent China, and this central government does, in World War I, it picks the right side. It allies with the Allied powers against the Central powers, so it's on the side of the United States, France, and Great Britain against Germany, and so forth. And during World War I, Japan, in 1915, attempted to make use of the fact that the Europeans were out killing each other, and so weren't very concerned with Asia, in order to issue the so-called 21 demands, and against China. And we don't need to go into what these demands were all about. We just need to note that these demands would have seriously infringed on Chinese sovereignty. But basically, and these were issued to Yuan Shikai. This is before he declared himself emperor and before he died in 1916. And the demands are leaked, and the Chinese, there's major protests among Chinese people against them, and eventually Japan has to backpedal to a large degree. But the key thing is this helps build more nationalism among the Chinese people, and helps develop this kind of the skills needed in order to wage effective protests. Now, both China and Japan were with the Allied nations, and one reason Japan had allied with the Allied nations, with Great Britain, the United States, and so forth, was because they wanted Germany's colonies in Asia, so they allied with the Allies and then declared war on Germany and took those colonies. Some of those colonies and some of the territories they took over were in China. And so the Chinese expected that since they were also allies and had sent a couple 100,000 Chinese to Western Europe to work digging trenches, they expected that these German lands would be returned to them. They weren't. Japan was allowed to keep them, even though they were Chinese, right? So Germany had taken colonies from China, or taken over parts of China, and then Japan took those away, and China thought they would be given back, and they weren't at the Versailles Treaty. So the Chinese delegation actually walked out of the Versailles Treaty. And there were massive protests in China, staged in particular from Beijing University, and that's Cai Yunpei here, this picture. That is that's the president of Beijing University, and he's the guy that turned it into a serious academic institution, and encouraged people to talk and share their ideas freely, and also to be involved politically. And so the students at this university were studying while being very well aware of what was going on, and they launched these kind of massive protests. And this was the start of and this began on May 4th, so at least what we call the May 4th movement in China. Now, the May 4th movement leads to a lot of new ideas, and one of the people, and it leads to a transformation in the way that radical reformers and elite intellectuals think about China and think about reform. And you can see this in this man, Chen Duxiu, and his journal, New Youth, which he is the editor of. And it's important. I mean, these two words, New Youth, right? It's very forward-looking. It's not looking back to the time of the ancient sage emperors. It's not looking back to Confucius. It's saying we need to go forward. The future of our nation is in the new and in young people. And this includes Chen and the people contributing to this are really iconoclasts. They write against Confucian virtues. They write against the chastity cult. They write against the family system, and they support switching from kind of classical Chinese to writing in the way that people spoke. So they were going to make kind of vernacular Chinese the main language, which of course would make it easier to learn and to study and so forth. And to give you another example of this kind of willingness to embrace the new and the young, Lu Xun, who Du Bois talks about, he specifically mentions his story of Qiu, which I think is a really good story. I really like Lu Xun as an author. But Lu Xun also wrote an interesting story called The Madman's Diary, which is a government official who's reading he's reading a journal reading about Chinese history. Or it's a diary of a Chinese official who's reading Chinese history. And he sees in between the lines of all the history books the continuous words, people eating people. And what it is, it's talking about how Chinese history is not this kind of great, wonderful story of the most civilized country on the face of the earth. It's a story of people destroying each other, right? And in a sense, this is a history we need to turn away from, and we need to embrace something much more humane, right? So there's this idea, this cutting away from the past and rejection of the past. So now we have this, China's going from this very conservative reform to this very, very radical reform. And there's two kind of solutions to this form, and it's interesting, they're referred to as human beings, even though they're ideas. One is Mr. Democracy, and the other is Mr. Science. And it's this idea that these two things, democracy and science, are what's going to save China. By making these moral reforms, by reacting against Confucian virtues, the chastity cult, which refers to the idea that that women were praised for not remarrying after their husbands died, and if they were violated or dishonored in some ways, that they should kill themselves. These things should be rejected. The family system should be rejected, and we should undertake very serious reforms of language, right? So these are very, very powerful ideas that are becoming increasingly popular in China. And of course, religion was going to become a part of this as well. In particular, the Boxers. Now, remember, going back, we talked about the May 4th movement, right? This movement that begins in 1919, and actually, there's different years given for when it ends, but one year, for example, is 1923, and some people try and push it all the way up to 1915. The key thing is between 1915 and 1923 or so, you have this very strong willingness to question the old ways. And there, what's really striking is that Chen Duxiu, this editor of New Youth, wrote a article looking back to the Boxers and looking back to this issue of superstition. He notes the Germans, after the Boxer Rebellion was put down, one of their officials, a man named von Kettler, had been murdered by the Boxers, and so a monument was built to him. And during the May 4th movement, this monument was torn down, and many Chinese people were rejoicing how this represented the rejection of imperialism and so forth. And Chen Duxiu looked at this and said, no, that's not what's happening. This isn't good. The Boxers were born of superstition, and we Chinese people are still superstitious. So we may tear down the von Kettler model statue, but if we don't change our ways, then it's just going to come back. Then superstition is just going to come back, right? And it's going to cause the same trouble, right? And he identifies this kind of issue we pointed to, is that underneath in Chinese religion you have this apocalyptic strain that when things go bad it rises up. And he calls this superstition, and he's afraid of it, that it's going to cause China to suffer the same kind of indignities that happened after the Boxers rebelled, right? You remember I showed that photo of the Japanese soldiers who had cut off the Chinese heads, and we had noted that after the Boxer Rebellion was put down, many Chinese people were killed out of revenge for what had happened to the Christians, and to the Chinese Christians, to the Christian missionaries, and to Western officials, and so forth. And Chen Duxiu in his essay identifies 5 reasons for the Boxers, and 5 reasons for why that are still strong within, that could lead to their coming back. And this is in 1919, right, that he's writing. He talks about Taoism, and he says Taoism has superstition and heterodoxy in it, and that's one reason the Boxers came. And he gives an example, the Jade Emperor called on people to destroy the Westerners, He criticizes Buddhism and says that its philosophy of a spiritual world above the material encouraged boxers, as well as its idea of magical power. Confucianism he blamed because you have this idea that you should revere the king and expel the barbarians, which is what the boxers were saying they were going to do. And he also pointed out that even Chinese opera, that's where the gods came from, right? A lot of the gods in the Chinese pantheon are actually from Chinese opera, and people imitated those, right? And so these are the olds. These are the things we need to get rid of, right? And he's got the three teachings there, as well as Chinese folk religion. He's saying we need to turn away from this. This stuff is bad, right? We need to reject the three teachings. I mean, this is huge. And he also identifies one of the major problems is the hostility to new learning. And of course, and by this he means Mr. Democracy and Mr. Science, right? And if we take in this new learning, we'll get rid of superstition, which is good because it's superstition, which is a word for these religions he doesn't like, right? If we get rid of these religions that are bad, it will help to make us a strong country. And Chen goes on to write in the New Youth this really wonderful, or I should say evocative paragraph. There are at present two paths open to us. One is the path of light that leads toward republicanism, science, and atheism. The other is the path of darkness leading towards autocracy, superstition, and theism. If our people do not wish for a revival of the Boxers, if they are loath again to contemplate the erection of humiliating memorials like the von Kettler Monument, which of these paths, in the last analysis, shall we take? And of course the path we should take is republicanism, science, and atheism, right? This is the path that we need to tread if we want to make a strong, powerful, modern, enlightened China. Now, as I said, talked about previously, you have this idea that Christianity, or among Christian missionaries and among many Chinese Christians, that China will become a Christian republic. And it's important to note that the first president of the Chinese Republic was Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who was himself a Christian, and also that Chiang Kai-shek, who Du Bois talks about a lot, but I don't think he mentions it, or maybe he doesn't make a whole big deal out of it himself. Chiang Kai-shek was actually also a Christian. They were both Protestant Christians. And there was this, like I pointed to earlier, there's this idea of establishing a Protestant, liberal, civilized, democratic China. But there was actually some success in the early 1900s with this idea. There were Protestant Christianity seemed to be booming. People seemed to say this is the way that we're going to go, and that these are things that we should borrow. But as we saw with Chen Duxiu, the radicals, the people who are really on the cutting edge of arguing where China needs to go, they link theism, belief in God, with autocracy and superstition. Right, so they basically mean by superstition any kind of religion, not just the three teachings. They also include Christianity in this, right? And so Christianity, in a sense, has the bad luck of being, when it first comes to China, it's too radical, and so it's rejected. Later on, though, it's too conservative, and therefore is in a part rejected. And in both cases, it's always too foreign, right? It's just connected too much to the old ways, right? And some of the things that seem to make Christianity attractive, people realized they didn't need to be Christian to enjoy. For example, science, right? People did make arguments for why science supported Christianity, but especially as Chinese. Remember, I talked about how these missionaries are translating books they're writing books on science, using science to try and convert people to Christianity. So, for example, they talked about the uterus as being this really amazing organ, and since it's so amazing, we know there must be a God that exists. And they avoided translating Darwin's ideas as much as possible. But then Chinese started reading books from Japan, which had no problem talking about these ideas. They said, oh, okay, we don't need to be Christian to embrace new sciences. Christianity also, one reason it was so powerful was it brought new associations, new ways of kind of organizing people towards different goals. So, for example, the YMCA. When we think YMCA, we think, okay, this is this village people song, or it's a place where you can go exercise. There's not particularly that much Christian about it anymore. But for a long time, it was the vanguard of kind of a Christian idea of civilization, of spreading morality, of spreading science, and so forth. And it was very effective in China, but people realized, hey, we can borrow this means of association without becoming Christian, and it will still be useful. So you could form a young Buddhist or a young men's Buddhist association if you wanted to, and just borrow that. The way things are organized. That's essentially what happens in many respects. Either other religions will borrow these ways, or secular organizations will borrow them. And eventually what happens, especially in the 1920s when the nationalists become very powerful, is missionaries are often attacked and missionary property is often destroyed because missionaries are connected, they're just too foreign, right? They're connected too much to the old ways, they're just they're too foreign, we can't really trust them. They control our and many of the most modern schools, of course, are run by missionaries. We don't want them to control our education. We want to make new Chinese subjects, new Chinese citizens, not necessarily make Christians. So schools are regulated. They're not allowed to, for example, it was a rule in many Christian schools, if you attended, you had to attend chapel. And they would force them, no, you can't do that anymore. They'd be forced to cut down or eliminate even the amount of time spent teaching religion. And sometimes schools were just seized outright. So the hopes of establishing, in a sense, China kind of jumps over the idea of a Christian republic. Instead of going from conservative reform to a Christian republic, they just go to radical reform for the most part. Now, there are, of course, people who still want to establish a kind of a Christian republic, but for the most part, they're not going to be the most powerful people. And even though Chen and the others are, other important Chinese leaders are Christians, as we'll see, their ideas are being guided from other sources. In Cheng's case, particularly fascism. Now, Dubois looks at this law of 1927, which I think is important because it gives us kind of an idea of how the state is still relating to religion. This law, I mean, there's not really, the government isn't all that powerful at this time. I mean, it's starting to get more and more powerful. We call the period 1927-1937 the Nanjing Decade, where Chiang Kai-shek has actually managed to centralize, taking control of a lot of the government, or I'm sorry, a lot of the country, not all of China, but a good portion of China. And so this is a time when you can bring out reforms. Though this reform won't be that strong, it does make some headway in kind of the goals that the government has. And it's interesting, they don't go as far as the radicals we've been looking at who want to abolish religion entirely, who see religion as very dangerous, but they see it as something that might be dangerous, that needs to be regulated, which is essentially the policy that the Chinese state has been following throughout since the Ming Dynasty and even before, that we've been looking at, right? We don't want to get rid of religion. We have this policy of religious tolerance where we'll use religion when it's helpful and we'll kind of push it down when it's not. But at the same time, you still have these, most of the most powerful countries in the world are Protestant Christian, especially the United States and Great Britain. They're still Protestant leaders. They're still an important faction within the nationalists. So they also need to look like a liberal Protestant republic. So they adopt the language of freedom of religion while at the same time they adopt the language of freedom of religion while enacting a policy that's really more of a policy of religious tolerance instead. And basically what they argue is that this is necessary because the masses are just too degraded to really have free will. They can't really have religious freedom in a sense because they're just too backwards and too dumb. Essentially, they're just stupid commoners. They don't know what they're doing. They're like children. They can't have free will in a sense. So we need to teach them, and then they can have actual religious freedom. And so this, what you do, as Dubois talks about, is the state can decide what gods go in what temples. Which is basically what China's kind of been doing forever. And I would argue that that's essentially, as we'll see with this course, that for the most part, even though China adopts language that sounds like ideas regarding freedom of religion, in a sense, their actual policy is still one of religious tolerance. And you can see this in how things are defined, especially there's this idea of superstition, which is bad, versus religion, which is tolerable, and which has freedom. And of course it's the government that decides whether you are a superstition or whether you're a religion. And we saw with Chen, Duxiu, he considered Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism all to be superstitions that we need to get away from. So this means that while there'll be some variations within the government policy, where sometimes something will be considered a superstition, other times a religion. For the most part, what this policy allows you to do is to kind of play a name game, where again you make it look like you have freedom of religion, when in fact you have religious tolerance instead. So, and it's interesting, Dubois talks about the nationalists, especially Chiang Kai-shek, whose actual name is more something like Jiang Jieshi. I don't know how he became Chiang Kai-shek. I mean, it's really a very poor pronunciation. I don't know how that happened, but in any case, we're going to refer to him as Chiang Kai-shek because that's usually how he's referred to. He's this, as I point out, he's a convert to Christianity, but in his case, it seems like it was mostly about power and about keeping up good relationships with the Chinese Christian elites and with the United States, which would end up being one of his most powerful backers. And he's first and foremost a military man. He basically rises to power and takes over the republic. And he's kind of the successor of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, but whereas Dr. Sun Yat-sen doesn't have an army, Chiang does, and he leads that army from 1920 on what's called the Northern Expedition, which captures a very large portion of Chinese territory and unites much of China and forms basically a functioning central government. It doesn't control everything, but controls a good part. And this leads to the so-called Nanjing Decade, because his capital was in Nanjing, the old capital of the Ming Dynasty, and that lasts from 1927 to 1937. 1937 is when the Japanese really started to invade. Now, he has a lot of problems, though, with his party. The Nationalist Party doesn't have a very strong ideology. Its ideology was very vague, and in some cases very weak. He also faces serious threats from the communists because, unlike the nationalists, they have a very strong ideology, and they're very well organized. And he also has to face problems of corruption within the Nationalist Party. There's a lot of people who belong to the Nationalist Party just because it's powerful, not because they believe in it. And so, over time, he moves more and more in a fascist direction. He really admires Nazi Germany and Italy. And it's important for us to remember, and I certainly don't want to defend fascism, but when we're thinking historically, we need to remember when this is going on. And this is in the early 1930s. And he's looking at the liberal democracies, and they aren't doing well. Right? There's the Depression, the stock market crash, and all those things. And the liberal democracies don't seem to be doing well. People were interested in liberal democracy in the 1920s because they're the ones that won World War I. And they were the ones that seemed to be economically powerful. So people want to be successful, right? So they turn to success. And the liberal democracies were not looking good during this time. On the other hand, the fascists in Italy and Germany seem to have the solutions to the problems that the liberal democracies weren't able to solve. And so that's why Chiang was interested in fascism, because it seemed to be working. And also, he was a dictator, and both of these, both Italian and German fascism, exalt the leader, right? Il Duce, the Mussolini, and of course Adolf Hitler. And so he tried to embrace and imitate this movement. And this led to the New Life movement of 1934. And what's fascinating, of course, is that even though you have many people criticizing Confucianism and saying that religion is superstitious and so forth, a lot of the basic ideas are still there, right? That we, the elite, need to educate the dumb, kind of backwards Chinese masses so that, and they need to be reformed morally so they can save the nation, right? And this has been what's going on in a certain sense since the Ming Dynasty and before. The change, though, of course, is he has mass communication, he has radio, he has movies, he has newspapers to spread this ideology. And Dubois talks about that it's interesting how specific this gets, right? There's rules about how you should act at movies. You should be quiet during movies. Don't talk with your mouth open. I'm sorry, don't eat with your mouth open. Don't spit. Don't throw garbage in the street. And this seems, of course, like kind of nitpicky. How would this have to do with the nation? But the idea is by transforming the way you think, you can transform the way you behave. And by making you a considerate, responsible citizen, you'll be willing to sacrifice yourself to restore the nation state, to strengthen it, and to defend its sovereignty, right? So it's supposed to lead to a moral transformation that would strengthen the nation. And so what we see here is, in a sense, while religion is becoming, in many ways, not nearly as powerful as it once was, right? Confucianism is, in many ways, rejected by the radical reformers, and it's they who were going to win out. And none of them are really seriously, at least for a time, they're going to win out over Chiang, who at least wants to have some kind of revival of Confucianism. They're going to, of course, win out in the form of the communists over this. There's still this underlying idea of Chinese thought connected with Confucianism that has this idea that morality is important, that morality will save the nation, and that we need to transform the way we think and make moral citizens in order to save the world. Or, I'm sorry, in order to save our country. And that's where we're going to stop, and we will have the overflow material next Friday before the test, and we'll have the overflow material, and we'll have the review for the test. That will occur on March 9th is when we'll have that, and then on March 13th you will have your midterm, and I look forward to seeing you all there.